What if a simple yes could change your life forever? Mark was just a young man struggling to support his family with no hope of a better future, until one unexpected night, a millionaire woman made him an absurd proposal. Marry her in exchange for money, power, and security. What seemed like just a cold deal soon turned out to be something much bigger. Secrets came to light. Impossible choices had to be made, and Mark found himself facing a dilemma that could define not only his fate, but that of thousands of people. Was he ready to pay the price for this deal? Get ready for an intense story, full of twists and turns, emotions, and a truth that will change everything. The alarm clock went off at 6 in the morning, but Mark was already awake. The thin mattress wasn't comfortable, and the weight of his worries didn't let him sleep properly. The peeling ceiling above his head was a silent reminder of everything he hadn't yet managed to change. In the next room, he heard the slow, fragile breathing of Carmen, his mother. A cough followed, dry and persistent. Mark closed his eyes for a moment before getting up. He knew that by now, the stock of medicine would be running out. In the kitchen, he found Monica preparing a strong black coffee. She smiled when she saw him, but he could see the tiredness hidden behind that gesture. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. "Enough," he lied. The girl, still in her pajamas, took a sip of her coffee and looked at him expectantly. "Any news about that internship?" Mark clenched his jaw and looked away to the window. The internship that could earn him a small extra salary never got past the first contact. "Not yet." Monica let out a sigh and leaned on the table. "I'll manage. If I need to, I can sell a few things." "You're not selling anything," Mark interrupted. Monica wanted to help, but he refused to accept that his sister had to give up the few things she had. He was responsible for the family, and failure was not an option. Shortly afterwards, Carmen appeared in the kitchen, leaning on the doorframe. "You two whispering early in the morning. That's never a good sign," she said, with a faint smile. Mark came forward to help her sit down. Carmen looked even thinner than the day before, and that made him uneasy. "And I was telling Monica that everything will work out. I'll manage." Carmen touched his hand affectionately. "You always try to carry the world on your back, my son. Just be careful not to lose your way." Mark just nodded. He couldn't afford to fail. The office where Mark worked was small, stuffy and full of documents. Piles of papers littered the desks, and the computers were old, slow as the exhausting pace of each day. "I need you to sort this out before lunch," said his boss, leaving a stack of contracts on the table. Mark didn't complain. He picked up the papers and started going through them, his eyes jumping from one clause to the next. If he wanted to stay there, he had to do his job properly. The voices of the other employees reached him in a muffled way. "The event at the luxury hotel tomorrow is going to be a spectacle," said one of them. "Only for those with money," replied another. "It's a great place to make contacts. Important people always turn up." Mark looked up, interested. Contacts. He didn't know anyone influential, but maybe it was time to change that. In the evening, when he returned home, Mark felt the weight of exhaustion on his shoulders. Carmen was already asleep, and Monica was finishing her homework at the living room table. "You look strange," she commented, frowning. "I'm thinking of going to an event tomorrow." Monica stopped writing. "What kind of event?" "An event for rich people. Maybe I'll meet someone who can help me with a better job." She was silent for a moment. "I think you should try," she said at last. Mark nodded. For the first time in a long time, he felt that something new was about to happen. Mark adjusted the knot of his tie in front of the mirror. The fabric was rough and tight, but he tried to ignore it. The clothes he was wearing weren't his own, and the shoes pinched his toes. His co-worker had lent him the suit, saying that no one would notice if he blended in well. When he arrived at the hotel where the event was taking place, he felt out of place. The lobby was covered in gleaming marble, imposing chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and waiters passed by holding silver trays with glasses of champagne. Men in well-cut suits chatted to each other with confident expressions, while elegantly dressed women laughed at something Mark couldn't hear. He crossed the room, feeling the stares on him. Did everyone there realize that he didn't belong there? He picked up a glass of water from one of the tables and forced himself to take a deep breath. He needed to concentrate. He was there for a reason. It was then that he noticed a woman sitting alone at a table further away. Her grey hair was tied up in an impeccable bun, and her simple but sophisticated black dress gave her a strong presence. Unlike the other guests, she didn't seem concerned with impressing anyone. Her eyes met Mark's. He tried to look away. But, to his surprise, she made a discreet gesture with her hand, beckoning him to come closer. He hesitated. Who was that woman? But his curiosity was greater. "You look lost," she said when he got close. Her voice was firm, but not arrogant. "Maybe because I am," Mark replied. She smiled slightly and pointed to the chair in front of him. "Sit down." Mark obeyed. "Sulan," she introduced herself without formality. "Mark." She analyzed his face for a moment, as if trying to see beyond what he was showing. "So, Mark, what does a young man like you do at an event like this?" He knew he could lie, pretend he was part of that world, but there was something in her gaze that disarmed him. "I'm looking for an opportunity, something that will change my life and help my family." Sue Ellen raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. You don't often hear that answer around here." Mark shifted in his chair, feeling vulnerable. "What about you? What are you doing here?" Sue Ellen let out a slight laugh. "Let's just say I'm looking for something too." Before he could ask any more, a waiter approached, pouring Sue Ellen another glass of wine. She thanked him, but kept her eyes on Mark. "What if I told you that I could offer you the opportunity you're looking for?" Mark's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I want you to marry me." Mark blinked, certain that he hadn't understood correctly. "What's that?" "A wedding. No love, no romance, just a contract." He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "I know it sounds absurd, but I have my reasons," she continued. "And in return, I'll solve all your financial problems. Your mother will receive the best medical treatment. Your sister will get the education she deserves." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "That doesn't make sense." Sue Ellen took a small sip of her wine before continuing. "I'm a practical woman. I have no heirs, no family. I've spent my life building something big, and now I need someone to rely on to keep it going. And you think I'm that person? I think you have the right heart for it." Mark looked down at the glass of water in his hand. Sue Ellen spoke with a calculated coolness, but there was something in her words that hit him directly. "You don't have to decide now," she said. "But if you want to change your life, come to me." She slid a small card with her number on it across the table. Mark picked it up, still stunned. That evening, as he walked home, he felt that his life had taken a turn. He just didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse. Mark stared at the card for long minutes after he got home. Sue Ellen's name was printed in elegant letters, along with a telephone number. He could simply tear it up and forget about that absurd proposal. But he couldn't. The thought kept hammering away in his head all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined his mother without the necessary medication, his sister giving up her studies, and himself stuck in that routine with no future. He got up and went into the living room, where Monica was sleeping with her books spread out on the table. A pencil was still between her fingers, as if she had erased it before finishing the last sentence. Mark took a blanket and covered her, feeling a tightness in his chest. If he accepted Sue Ellen's proposal, he could change everything. But at what cost? The morning passed without him falling asleep. At work, he couldn't concentrate. Every word of the contracts he was reviewing seemed distorted, and the noises around him sounded distant. "Hey, Mark!" called out a colleague. "Are you on the moon?" He forced a smile. "I'm just tired." The colleague shrugged and went back to his work. Mark rubbed his eyes, feeling a throbbing headache coming on. Everything seemed smaller now. The office, the work, the miserable salary. He was living a life that was leading nowhere. That evening, Carmen called Mark to sit next to her. His face was paler than usual, and his breathing seemed shorter. "You're worried about something," she said. Mark hesitated before answering. "I'm just trying to find a way to improve our situation," Carmen smiled weakly. "You've always been like that, ever since you were little, trying to solve everything yourself." Mark lowered his head. "Maybe I've found a solution." She frowned. "But it comes at a price." Silence fell between the two of them. "You'd do anything for us, wouldn't you?" Carmen asked. Mark clenched his fists. "Yes, I would." Carmen touched his face lovingly. "So whatever decision you make it because you believe in it, not because you feel you have no choice." Mark nodded, but deep down he felt that he had already chosen. The next day, while holding his cell phone in his hands, Mark took a deep breath before dialing the number on the card. The phone rang twice before Sue Ellen answered. "Mark." She knew it was him. "I'll take it," he said bluntly. On the other end of the line, Sue Ellen paused briefly before answering. "Very well. We'll meet tomorrow to iron out the details." Mark hung up the phone and let out a slow breath. There was no turning back. Sue Ellen's office was as spotless as she was. The floor shone, and the bookshelves full of expensive books gave the room an air of authority. Mark sat in the leather chair opposite her, trying to remain calm. A lawyer entered and placed a contract on the table. "The marriage will be legally valid, but without any marital obligations," Sue Ellen explained. "You'll keep your surname, you'll have access to my resources, and, when I'm no longer here, you'll take over the beneficial fund." Mark flipped through the pages, feeling his hands sweat. He was about to sign something that would completely change his life. "Any questions?" Sue Ellen asked. He stared at her for a moment. "Why me?" She didn't look away. "Because you're not driven by greed, but by need. That makes all the difference." Mark took the pen and signed. 2 days later, the wedding took place. No church, no grand ceremony, just Mark, Sue Ellen, 2 lawyers, and a judge. As they left the registry office, he realized how important that moment should have been. But for him, it was just an agreement. Inside the car, Sue Ellen looked at him and said, "From now on, your life will never be the same." Mark didn't know if that was a warning or a promise. Sue Ellen's apartment was a spectacle of luxury. Modern furniture, panoramic windows, and a view of the city that made everything seem small. "Your room is at the end of the corridor," said Sue Ellen. Mark walked across the huge space and opened the door. The room was large but impersonal, as if no one had ever lived there. He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. Over the next few days, he began to understand the rules of the agreement better. Sue Ellen was direct. She didn't expect intimacy, nor did she try to create any emotional bonds. "I want you to learn all about the beneficial fund," she said. "You need to understand the responsibility you will have one day." Mark began to accompany her to meetings, visits to social projects, and dinners with influential businessmen. He was surrounded by a world he had never imagined he would be part of. But despite everything, something bothered him. Sue Ellen avoided talking about her personal life. Old photographs were hidden away, and there was a constant distance between her and any kind of emotional attachment. Mark felt that there was something more behind that impenetrable woman, and somehow he knew that sooner or later he would find out what it was. Mark was already getting used to the routine imposed by Sue Ellen. Every day, he accompanied her to meetings, learned about the projects financed by the fund, and learned about resource management. It was a completely new world for him, full of influential people, strategic decisions, and figures that seemed unreal compared to his old reality. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never fully understand this woman. Sue Ellen was meticulous, controlled everything down to the smallest detail, but maintained an impenetrable emotional barrier. She never talked about her personal life, her past, or how she had built her fortune. Mark respected her discretion, but deep down, he knew there was something she was hiding. One evening, on his way back from a meeting, he found an envelope on his desk with his name handwritten on it. His heart raced. Inside was a document that would change her life forever. The will was clear. Mark would be the sole heir to the trust and all of Sue Ellen's assets. He read and reread each line, trying to process the information. "Are you surprised?" Her voice echoed through the office. He looked up. Sue Ellen was standing in the doorway, watching him with her usual calm. "You already knew this would happen," she said. Mark closed the envelope carefully, his hands trembling. "But why?" She walked slowly over to the table and picked up one of the books. "Because I need someone to continue this after I'm gone." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, after I'm gone?" Sue Ellen sighed as if carrying the weight of a long-hidden truth. "I'm sick, Mark." The words hung in the air for a moment. He blinked, trying to understand. "Sick like—" She closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "Terminally." Mark felt the floor disappear. That night, he couldn't sleep. Sitting on the balcony of his luxurious apartment, he gazed at the illuminated city below. He thought about Carmen, about Monica, about the life he had before he met Sue Ellen. Nothing made sense anymore. He thought marriage would just be a contract, something cold, mechanical. But now he was involved in something much bigger than he had imagined. What if he didn't live up to the responsibility? Sue Ellen's benefit fund wasn't just about money. It was a gigantic project that helped thousands of people. How could someone like him, a young man with no experience, take on something like this? He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. The next day, Sue Ellen noticed Mark's restless gaze. "You don't have to decide now," she said. He clenched his fists. "This isn't about deciding, it's about being able to." She smiled. "You're more capable than you think." Mark let out a slow breath. "Ever since we met, I've felt that you see something in me that I don't see myself." Sue Ellen put down the book she was reading on the table. "Have you realized why I agreed to talk to you that night at the event?" He frowned. "I never asked." She leaned forward slightly. "Because you didn't ask me." Mark blinked, confused. "Everyone who approaches me wants something. Money, influence, favors, but not you." He remained silent. "You have a sincere heart, Mark. And that's why I trust you with everything I've built." He swallowed. "I'm afraid of failing." "Fear should never be a deterrent," said Sue Ellen, "but rather a reminder that you care." Mark lowered his head, absorbing those words. He had never thought of it like that. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. Now he understood Sue Ellen's haste, her coldness, and her obsession with the benefit fund. Her body began to show the signs of illness. Her steps became slower, her posture less imposing. Some meetings had to be cancelled, and even though she tried to hide it, Mark could see the effort she was making to maintain her routine. "I don't have much time left," she said one evening. "I want to make sure that the work I've started doesn't disappear with me." Mark felt torn between empathy and the overwhelming responsibility that now fell to him. He still didn't know if he was ready, but there was no more time for doubt. Sue Ellen was dying, and it would be up to him to decide whether he was ready to take on her legacy. The silence in the apartment had become heavier in recent days. Sue Ellen spent more and more time in her room, and Mark noticed that her presence in the hallways was no longer the same. He walked around the living room, looking at the books she used to read, the perfectly organized objects, the impeccable environment that reflected the control she had always had over her life. But now, that control was slipping out of his hands. One evening, while she was going over some reports from the benefit fund, Sue Ellen entered the room. Her steps were slower, but her presence still commanded respect. "Is everything under control?" she asked with a calm tone. Mark looked at the papers in front of him. "Yes, I'm trying to absorb everything as quickly as possible." She nodded and approached the armchair opposite him. "You've been doing a good job." Mark didn't reply immediately. "I wish I could do more." Sue Ellen smiled slightly. "You already are." Her gaze wandered around the room, as if absorbing every detail. "This apartment has never been a home to me," she said unexpectedly. Mark frowned. "Never? It's always been a functional space. Something that kept me protected, but that's not what defines a home." Mark felt a tightness in his chest. If he could go back, would he have done anything differently? She thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe I would have allowed myself to trust people more." Mark looked at Sue Ellen, trying to see her beyond the strong figure she had always shown herself to be. She had spent her life building an empire, but in the end, she was alone. And now, she was entrusting him with everything she had built. A few days later, Sue Ellen's health deteriorated dramatically. Doctors were called in to help her, but Mark knew that time was running out. One morning, when he entered her room, he found her looking out of the window. "It's beautiful outside," she said without turning her face. Mark sat down in the chair next to the bed. "Would you like me to open the curtain more?" She smiled slightly. "No, that's good." Silence fell between the two of them. After a while, Sue Ellen took a deep breath. "Promise me you'll keep going." Mark swallowed. "I promise." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing those words. "Thank you, Mark." That night, Sue Ellen left. The funeral was discreet, just as she wanted. Few friends, a few businessmen and beneficiaries of the fund attended. Mark stood by the coffin, receiving words of consolation that seemed far away. He knew the moment would come, but he didn't expect it to hurt so much. After the ceremony, he walked alone through the streets. His mind was filled with memories, promises, and the weight of a new responsibility. He stopped in front of one of the charitable fund's projects, a community clinic. Inside, he saw people being attended to, mothers holding children, elderly people smiling at the doctors. That was Sue Ellen's legacy, and now it was his too. Over the next few months, Mark immersed himself in the work. He studied every detail of the fund, got to know the beneficiaries, met with entrepreneurs, and ensured that the projects kept running. There were challenges, people doubting his ability, financial difficulties, obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But with every problem solved, with every life impacted, he felt he was exactly where he should be. One afternoon, while organizing old files in his office, he found a letter with his name on it. It was from Sue Ellen. "Mark, if you're reading this, then you know I'm no longer here. I want you to know that from the first moment I saw you that night at the event, I knew you were the right person to continue this work, not because you were perfect, but because you understood the value of what really matters. Remember, transforming lives is the greatest legacy we can leave. I trust you, Sue Ellen." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his drawer. Then he looked at the pile of papers in front of him and took a deep breath. There was a lot to do, and he was ready.